Hi, this is Anirban Sen. Welcome to another episode of M&A Stories with Fifth Chrome Insights. As you know, that in each episode we try to bring in stories based on real life experiences from practitioners around the world. Today's topic is innovation. So, what really is innovation, especially in the world of mergers and acquisitions, which tends to be very, very definitive, structured, and follows a strict script? To tell the story, we have been joined by Toby Tester all the way from Australia. Welcome, Toby. How's it going? Welcome to Fifth Crown Insights YouTube podcast.
Well, good. I'm glad to be on the podcast. So thank you very much indeed for inviting me.
Yeah, and we were just talking about the outbreak and the lockdown that you have in Sydney right now. How is it affecting you and your business?
Well, look, the thing is, everybody's working from home anyway, and like elsewhere around the world, people have taken to working home quite well. We've got the technology; it's all set up, and look, it's fine. It's fine, generally fine. And also at a personal level, look, I happen to be living in a fairly nice part of Sydney, just by the beach. So, the beach is literally just a few hundred meters away from where I am right now. Nice part of the world. So if you're going to be in lockdown, I could have chosen worse places to be in lockdown. That's all I can say.
That is absolutely so true, because we live in Amsterdam's city centre, and this is so different compared to some of the countryside. So it's good to have you on our show. Let's start with a bit of an introduction here.
Yeah, sure. My name is Toby Tester. Very briefly, look, I've been working in mergers and acquisitions for about 20 odd years now. Quite surprising, actually, how much time it has been. It has been 20 years. It's amazing. Several dozen transactions. Worked around the world: India, United States, UK, Australia, New Zealand, of course. So yes, had a lot of experience, multiple industries. Currently working with Beyond the Deal, BTD Consulting, and done a number of very good assignments with them. So that's me. That's who I am.
Excellent. And you chose a very, very interesting topic, right? So when you said innovation, I was like first intrigued, and then I'm like, it's probably best handled by somebody like you who's got tons of industry experience. So what do you mean by innovation?
Well, when I talk about innovation, it is simplest level, because there's nothing very complicated about innovation for a start. I should say that it is one of those words that gets so heavily used. It's a bit of a cliche these days, but really all I'm talking about is just doing something new in a different way. It could be a new viable product to the market. It'd be something that gives the organization an added lift in terms of additional revenue or cost savings. So it's doing something that's different than to before.
When organizations look at innovation, and based on your experience, what kind of triggered for you to choose this particular topic?
Oh, okay. Well, it is very interesting, and it's really because of the time we're in right now. We are in an incredibly disruptive economy, and I think it's being made even more disruptive as a result of this whole pandemic. And, they often say that adversity creates opportunity. And as we emerge out of this pandemic, we are going to see a lot of transformation occur right across, where the business rules are going to be written in almost every single industry. Organizations are going to look at their supply chains all over again. They're going to look at what they do and how can they do things better given this new normal. So inevitably, there's going to be a lot of transformation occurring everywhere. And the key question, and you know this one as well as I do, you've got two ways of doing things. If you're going to transform, how are you going to do it? Well, you can go ahead and do it organically, inside, and you can go ahead and spend the money and that sort of thing. And it takes time. Now, the cheaper, faster, and often better alternative is to simply buy in that asset, purchase that asset, and use that asset to effectively transform what you're doing. So it's transformation through M&A. And that is being seen more and more often. I think you've seen it, I've seen it. Go back 20 years, and it'd be classic cost consolidations, economies of scale, and that sort of thing. What are organizations doing nowadays? They're looking at their business models or their operating models. They're looking to see how they change, and they're using that M&A as the way of doing that. So organizations are transforming themselves through M&A.
Right, 100%. And in fact, one of the things I was thinking after you mentioned about the topic itself is that there must be some sort of shortage of thinking on this particular aspect. And that's why you probably chose it. So why do you think organizations have not geared up to that sort of thinking yet?
Well, I think, to be honest, there's a bit of an overhang to the previous century. A lot of organizations, now I'll exclude a lot of the software organizations, high-tech firms, because they're very much operating in the 21st century. But a lot of organizations, there's a bit of an overhang to a more of a hierarchical, process-driven approach. And they're not geared up to working in a more dynamic, sort of agile manner. We talk about it an awful lot, but in actual fact, do people really do it? Well, yes, they do, but only in the high-tech firms. So I think there's a lot of catching up in other industries and many organizations to this different way of working.
Yeah, 100%. And in fact, what you just mentioned kind of nicely resonates with what I've seen as well. I mean, the 20th century thinking, which is primarily checklist based, you need to do this, tick, 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 tick. And go on.
And I agree with you. And and here's the fundamental problem, and we'll get right onto the topic of innovation. There is a very transactional way of working in mergers and acquisitions. Again, it's a conservative industry. It's a bit of an overhang from the previous century, where you tend to follow a kind of a more of a checklist or templated or procedural way of doing it, because that's how transactions work. Transactions really are pretty straightforward. You go ahead, you go ahead and work out what the deal is going to be. You work out the deal structure. You go through the negotiation. You go through a signing and a closing, and then obviously at the closing there's the exchange of money or shares or whatever the means is. But that is a transaction, and that's the way it works. What I have observed, unfortunately, is that transactional approach to doing actually permeates through the entire M&A process. So when you go to post-deal, it continues to be transactional instead of being something more transformational. So in other words, they'll still go through rigid playbooks, common templates, and all that sort of thing, and they're taking down a set of railroad tracks. And that's what I have seen so often. And I think we need to be doing things differently.
Yeah, absolutely. And why do you think that is? Because, what should change between pre-deal and post-deal, and why organizations don't recognize that shift that's required?
I think it's largely to do with risk. I think everybody knows that mergers and acquisitions is a high-risk game. Obviously you're dealing with very, very large discretionary corporate expenditure, and boards demand of their management that they don't screw up, that you've really got to make sure that you do this right. Don't screw it up, management. Don't do it. And so it's not so much risk management, they become risk averse or risk avoidance. So they want to make sure that they do whatever they can do to make sure they avoid the risks that you often hear about. But what it means is they take a risk adverse approach. And one of the problems about all that, of course, is that sometimes avoiding risk can be one of the riskiest things you can do, which is one of these paradoxes we have to deal with. And so what organizations do, and I find this happening all the time, is that they basically set the bar very low, whereby, yes, they'll get the work done. Yes, they'll get the minimum done in terms of what the deal required, in terms of the benefits or the savings that was expected, and do no more, because they're very concerned about not screwing things up. So this whole risk averse, risk avoidance sort of approach, transactional way of working, permeates through so that they can basically get the whole thing done out of the way without any screw ups in the whole exercise.
Yeah, wonderful. And I like the quote that you just created, which is the riskiest thing is risk aversion, right? So I really like that.
Yeah. Avoiding risk is one of the riskiest things you can do. Yep.
Absolutely. And in fact, when I sort of recollect some of my own experiences, plus also of the other practitioners, what we find is large companies, they would go and acquire small companies and completely absorb them, right? It's
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
take out everything, cannibalize the whole organization, and just bring them
Yeah.
in,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And mid-sized companies, they keep tucking in one company after the other without actually
Yeah.
integrating them in spirit and in structure, right? So,
Yeah.
given this, at the same time, what we see is in the private equity world, they tend to
Mm.
do a lot better. And I'm not talking about all the private equities. I'm talking about
Yeah.
some of the larger players as well as some of the mid-sized players, where they actually
Yeah.
start the post-merger situation or the stage
Mm.
with identifying new opportunities that go beyond financial structuring,
Yeah.
to start creating value. What
Yes,
is
they
that
do.
the experience that you have as well?
Yeah, I do. And one of the things that private equities companies do particularly well is they'll go into an industry and they will actually go ahead and acquire companies and roll up companies within that industry. And so they get the strength in terms of buying power, in terms of scaling up what they do, but they do it through a set of rolled up companies. And it's a very effective strategy for actually, becoming to actually own an industry in its own right. Choose an industry, make sure it's one that has lots of, like funeral industry is an absolute classic. Private equity has been so good in the funeral industry. Pet industry, vets. There's a lot of those industries, and they basically go in and they go ahead and bring up and roll up all these various companies. And it's an effective strategy for for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is something that we also see in the US as well as in Europe.
Yeah.
Private equities tend to do a much better job. Now, again, sort of going back to the merger and acquisitions scenario itself, right? I mean, we have
Mm.
bankers, we have lawyers, we have investment advisors. They all seem to be very centered around the transaction itself. But there
Yes,
is
they
a
are.
booming industry. But when it comes to post-merger integration, that's where the industry is still very fractional, and most of the companies, they claim to have internal expertise,
Yes,
but not necessarily true.
that's
So
true. That's true.
yeah,
I think the large issue is, and this is something which I think a lot of people say, is that they say, well, look, okay, well, we get all these experts to do the things pre-deal, and then post-deal, well, what we'll do is we'll go ahead and get whoever's on our project, one of our project managers, and we'll get our project office, and they can run it for us, and they can do all the various things afterwards. And so that's quite a common scenario. And it's seen through the lens of project management. In other words, it's a bit like, well, if you're going, the project managers typically what they do might do system upgrades. They might do maybe introduce a new system into the organization. Perhaps they might do a little bit of a change, maybe in terms of, I don't know, timesheets or whatever. Well, maybe we've done an acquisition, or maybe they can help out do that as well. And they say, well, what's the difference? It's a project management exercise, which is actually the wrong take. But that's though how it's so often done. And part of the problem, alluding earlier on about this whole transactional approach, because what happens is that the project managers, perhaps not knowing any better, have a somewhat mechanistic way of doing the work. In other words, they see the problem as, oh, we must go ahead and combine the business, and that's how they work, not necessarily the actual outcomes that you're actually looking for. So the outcomes, or whatever they may be, play secondary importance to the actual integration in itself.
right. And so, in fact, this entire discussion, I actually wrote an article, difference between an integration leader who needs to be more strategic, who needs to be more transformational,
Yeah.
and the
Yeah.
IMO, or the integration management office leader, who needs to be more project-oriented, structured,
Yeah.
making sure tasks are delivered, etc. Right. So,
Yeah.
uh, and a lot of companies, including large companies, we see that they
Yeah.
have these lengthy checklists that must be done in the 100 days. And quite often,
Yes.
once the 100 days are done, the checklists are pretty much covered, and that's it. And at the
Yeah.
same time, we
Yeah.
know that things like culture, things like system integration, things like operating model changes take longer
Yeah.
than that. What are some of the things that you would say that when people go with the project management approach that they largely miss out?
Sorry, say it again. What was the question?
Yeah, I mean, when you just mentioned about the project management approach, where it
Yeah.
tends to be a lot more mechanized,
Yes,
what
it
are
does.
some of the macro level details or elements
Okay.
that
Well,
companies miss out?
I think the issue is here is that what happens, we tend to take a very detailed view, very pragmatic way without understanding the big picture of what you're trying to achieve. And so I think there's an inherent problem with the whole project management approach is you tend to focus on the immediate things in front of you, not necessarily how things impact upon each other and also the broader aspect. So, for example, a lot of organizations don't do operating model analysis and design. Now, the key thing is about operating models is that operating models are really there to help you understand how value is created in an organization. And so without knowing that, you're never too sure what you're doing or what the consequences of what you're doing as part of the whole delivery of value as part of an M&A exercise, because the whole point of the integration exercise is to actually deliver the value. You know, everything up till the deal completion, all you've got is a promissory note to say that there will be value that will be delivered. Well, then the post-deal side is actually delivering it. But if you don't know what the operating model looks like and what you're actually changing in terms of the way value is delivered, then you're never too sure what you're doing is actually quite right. So you don't
100%.
have that big picture view. And I go further than this, is that when we are very focused on financial modeling, which is very, very important, but financial modeling really just asks the what and the if of value, not necessarily the how. The how of value comes from system analysis, system modeling, operating model design, because then you can actually understand from an engineering perspective how value is created, from the very beginning, from profit models all the way up to customer value propositions. And without that understanding, you really aren't sure whether you're delivering the optimum value from any kind of M&A deal.
100%. And in fact, it just reminded me of a transaction that I was involved in a few years back. And this has been kind of a phenomena that I've seen repeating itself. So people end up using Porter's five forces. And this is pretty much in every second thesis that I see. But so far, I've only seen one where they actually use the Porter's value chain, which is what you're just talking about.
Well, yeah. So and I think so it's important to do that. And interesting about the Porter's five forces. I mean, everybody knows it's a bit like SWOT analysis, but these are just merely tools to help you analyze some of the things you need to be doing or what value opportunities might exist. But there's only two out of a whole repertoire, big range of various tools and techniques you can employ at any one time. So I think what you've got to do is you've got to use the right tool for the circumstance, to actually help elicit the responses that you're looking for from team and from management.
Excellent. And we'll just come back to the tools pitch in a couple of questions. But you mentioned about agile approach, right?
Yeah,
so, and
agile.
I know based on our common friend Kisan Patel, right? So what's your take? And I think that kind of closely relates to innovation, the topic of innovation that you're talking about as well.
Sure.
So maybe let's do a deep dive into what you mean by agile.
Well, now one thing I don't mean by agile is necessarily the tools and techniques we're all familiar with. So as you know, there's things about scrums and there's sprints and there's burn down charts and all that sort of stuff, and product backlogs. Now that's all good, but really agile is much more from the leadership behavior and the team behaviors. It's really a reflection of the behaviors that looks. So it's much more of a cultural thing. And that is accountability, making sure that accountability is clearly placed in people, but also that they also got the authority. And I think it's working on accountability really well, because it needs to be the kind of accountability whereby people are ready to admit failure or admit something wrong, And that's okay in an organization, because a lot of organizations it's not. There's a certain fear, and that's where agile doesn't work. So there has to be an environment where it's actually okay to admit mistakes and to be authentic as possible. So it's that idea of authenticity and accountability is very, very key. And then the other part of the agile is simply a willingness to report on progress, see how we're all going, and to check on that on a regular basis. Now, whether it's every day or every other day, but it's a way of working whereby it's dynamic. So you can make decisions quickly, see where we are, and then you can respond and get on with the work. So it's that quick, that speed of decision making, it's that speed of commitment, and to be able to report on that, as opposed to say going through large governance structures or that kind of stuff.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And in fact, I like a couple of points that you raised about bringing in agile. And I've also been using agile in some of the transactions that I've been involved in.
Yeah.
What I find is the best way to describe agile is when there is a large amount of uncertainty related to a certain thing, which is trying to bring culture together or creating those operating models where you have to probably, that's where agile philosophy, to your point, agile philosophy is a lot better suited than a waterfall, which is here is the estimation upfront, and everything is going to be followed through to the T. So,
it's certainly agile works a lot better if you, particularly dealing with looking to capture revenue synergies from a deal, because there's a certain ambiguity. There's a bit of uncertainty about what that revenue opportunity might be. So there's an element of experimentation whereby you're having to work through how big this opportunity is, whether it's experimentation through whiteboarding, or whether it's experimentation through doing some quick changes perhaps on the website, or other things, maybe quick changes in the pricing model. But nonetheless, there's a sort of feedback loop you're looking for to see whether in actual fact you're getting the optimum synergy from that particular action, which is inherently an agile thing, as opposed to maybe installing a new computer system, or moving offices, or other things. That's waterfall. It's deterministic. There's very low ambiguity. We've all done it before. You can do it again.
Yeah, 100%. Now, just changing gears a bit here. You've been running your own podcast show for a while, right? So let's hear a bit about that. What has been your experience, your learning, and what kind of triggered it off for you to get started?
Well, yeah, I've been doing a podcast for a while, and to be honest, we're doing it with another guy down in Melbourne, Robert Heaton. And I think the interesting part about M&A is I think the stories. I think we've been looking at disasters, why M&A goes wrong. So what we've been doing, every week is actually telling a disaster story to each other. And so we've been doing them all, we know them all, whether it's HP, Autonomy, Daimler-Benz, and Chrysler, and going on. And I think it's interesting insofar as that when things go wrong, they always teach you so much more. It's all very well things going right and you think that's fine, but it's when things going wrong. And I think it's those lessons you take, learning from other people's mistakes or other organizations' mistakes and saying, okay, you shouldn't repeat these mistakes. They've been made before, they've been made again, and we're talking billions and billions of dollars here at stake here. So for whatever you do, guys, don't repeat these mistakes, And so that's hopefully the message we're coming through.
Sure.
And there are certain repeating themes with all this, There are certain comments, you can almost see them coming down, You almost get a kind of a sixth sense as to what these potential problems might be. Anyway, that's what we do, and we tell stories to each other, disaster stories.
Yeah, and that's actually a great way to learn. Learn from the disasters. Now, are the number of disasters coming down? And if it is that because the industry is maturing more, or do you still see the mistakes are still being repeated, and that's because there are people who are involved in this space who are not ready to acknowledge the challenges and the problems?
Well, yeah, you're right, because look, I look at the surveys and I see the integration reports done by the major consulting firms, and I have seen success rates improve. So it is much better than say it was, say, 20 years ago or 10 years ago nowadays. And I think that's really simply because people understand that there is a process here. There is a certain set of steps you take when it goes through, when it comes from, say, for example, between signing and closing, there's a whole bunch of things you've got to get done, and also post-deal. And I think there's a common vernacular now. People understand there is such a thing as a 100-day plan or a 90-day plan, and it's part of the language, that's introduced. So I think that M&A as a result has got a larger vocabulary. People understand that these things you do, and you've got to do it seriously. You do need to have project managers, to do things, to actually go ahead and integrate and do that sort of stuff. So the results are much better. Going back to the original question, when I talked about innovation, I still think there's a heck of a lot of room for improvement, because it comes down to maturity thing. We talk about project management, but there's one step above that, and that's the integration manager type thing. And that's not quite project manager. That's more cultural, much more outcome focused. It's definitely more commercial in its approach. And it's that whole outcomes thinking, which is key. And I think there's a step even beyond that. And that's when it comes to innovation, that the key is, and this is where I think a lot of organizations miss out on, is that the perfect time to be innovating is actually when you're integrating, because that's when you've got the people, they're working under pressure. There's a lot of things happening, but you've got engagement, you've got commitment, you've got tight time spaces. And the way innovation works, it thrives on adversity. It thrives when there's a struggle. And you can get a lot of ideas, you get a lot of thoughts, people energized, emotions intact, to be able to elicit other things you could be doing. And you don't want to lose that. And you will lose that, and you won't capture those additional synergies from a deal if you don't think or consider the more innovative aspects you could be doing with that asset you're acquiring.
And that's that line of thinking has triggered another question, which is not part of the script.
Oh, yeah.
But since we're talking between practitioners here, a lot of
Yeah.
companies would go and acquire another company for their product, and what they try to do is they completely absorb the company into
Yeah.
the main structure. And what
Yeah.
that essentially means is they keep anything to do with the product, and the rest of the organization they just completely get rid of, whether it's the sales and marketing or the management support structure. And that kind of kills it. What's innovation? And is that the right thing to do? I mean, and this is purely based on experience.
This is the that's what you're explaining to is one of the inherent problems with not doing your proper analysis, operating model analysis, but understanding something more that you and I know, something called capabilities. And that is that, when you say a company has a particular product, that might be a capability, but that capability is not just the product in itself, but it's those things that people do to be able to deliver that product. And it's understanding the connections that allow you to do that. So a product on its own may not survive without the rest of the operating model being there. And so you've got to be careful here, in terms of that. You just can't plug out an operating model. You can't plug out a customer experience. You can't plug out even a profit model sometimes. You've got to look at the connections associated with that, because there are things that go along with it. And so it needs a little bit more care when you do that sort of thing.
Wonderful. And that kind of brings me to the next question, which is around, again, based on experience. A lot of people in the integration, they have checklists, but not a lot of usage of tools and frameworks and templates, except for a templatized version of a checklist, right?
Yeah.
What are some of your favorite tools?
Okay, one of my favorite tools actually is the operating model. I invariably bring that together, because sometimes people think operating model is the same as org structure, which is not. It's not that. It's much more geared towards the value chain. So I'd be very interested in terms of how value gets created in a business. So typically, I would be very interested in how the opportunity order to cash process. So I'd be interested to know how that works and to break down the process, because that's where the primary value is. So operating model analysis is one of the key tools that it's one of the go-to tools I invariably want to bring up, because often they don't actually have one, that's why.
Sure.
And you can't talk about a future state of a company unless you got an operating model and say, well, this is what it looks like, guys. You're here now, and you can put it up on a whiteboard. Here it is, nice big picture. That's what you're going to be in 6 months' time or a year's time.
Yeah,
So operating model is probably one of my favorite tools.
yeah, and is this something that you've developed, or is this something that you use a standard framework?
I tend to, there's multiple ways of doing operating model analysis. I tend to prefer the operating model canvas, because people are familiar with the business model canvas. With the operating model canvas, it naturally flows on from that. And I think it's something you can use with post-it notes. You can whiteboard it, and I think it's fun and it's engaging. And
This is
so
helpful.
that's one of
Yeah, no, this is absolutely helpful. And in fact, a lot of our listeners have started asking me to include, some of your favorite tools and templates. So this is definitely helpful. Yeah.
Well, yeah, another favorite tool, in actual fact, I just mentioned earlier, and it's so funny, really. It's just a simple SWOT.
Yeah.
A SWOT. Everybody loves a SWOT. Why not do it? It helps people, engages people, and it's fun and interesting. So that's another favorite tool. Another favorite tool, and this is a very simple thing, is just simply doing, innovation techniques around revenue synergies. So getting people to go, consider what are the revenue synergy opportunities. So that's another tool. Another tool I like is a pre-mortem. Pre-mortems? Not a post-mortem, a pre-mortem.
Yeah, like a post-mortem,
This
you do
is
a pre-mortem. Yeah.
Yeah, pre-mortem. And a pre-mortem really is what you can say, well, look, I think this M&A deal is going to fail. Okay, you put it right on the front, okay? And you say, we're heading for disaster, guys. Now let's just backtrack as to why this occurred. And so what we try and do is analyze all the things that went wrong before they actually happened.
Yeah. It's kind of an extension of a scenario planning, and identify some key areas. So literally walk the future.
Yeah.
So, wonderful. Any tool that you use for leadership, culture, and/or people aspects?
What's a hard one? The difficulty with these things, sometimes the DeFi tools, sometimes the tools sometimes take you down a certain pathway, and I don't think that's quite right. I think these are much more leadership type questions you're asking, and I think you tend to go beyond the bounds of what a tool can help you with. Of course, there are tools there, like Pro-C tools, or there's various ones, but I think. Yeah, I think it's more to do with leadership skills in their own right to work out what's best to do in those circumstances. I'll say one thing for culture though, and I think with culture, it's often better to talk about culture in terms of the behaviors rather than culture per se, because culture in itself is actually intangible. So what you've got to do is go for the things you can actually manage, or at least identify and control. So you typically might say, well, look, here's a certain things that define culture in terms of whether it's meetings, whether it's org structure, that sort of thing. And then what you try and do is you actually try and influence just a few of those behaviors. And that's the way you steer culture through. But don't talk about culture in some broad terms, because it's not something you can measure or manage. It's highly subjective. So you've got to make it as objective as possible by pinning down the very specific behaviors you actually want to change.
That's insightful. Any technology tools or collaborative tools that you find useful?
Oh, I've used them all, to be honest. I've used Smartsheet a few times, quite surprisingly. That's often quite a good tool because it's, really and truly, I'm not a big one on tools per se, but you do need them. There's no doubt about it. You have them. I found Smartsheet quite useful a few times. So I'll use that. That one I've used a few times.
Right, and then the next question, sort of on the same theme, is around books and other sources where people can learn. Especially when it comes to integration.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the books is interesting because I think a lot of the books are much more procedural. These are the things you do. And I think that's good, but I think you kind of need to think beyond that as well, because it does come into that whole area of leadership. And so books are useful to read, but they only get you so far. I would suggest that there are some books. I mean, for example, I've always liked, I wonder if I've even got it here. Tim Galpin. He wrote a very good book, and I think he is one of the best books. Here it is. Yeah. So Mergers and Acquisitions by Tim Galpin, I think is a good book. I think it's intelligent, it's broad, it's big, and I think it's got some good little sort of pithy statements in it, so it's a nice, easy read. So that's a good book. But then I would say beyond that, I think you need to go to other books that are not to do with M&A so much, but more to do with operating model design or books around innovation or innovation techniques, because I think the very nature of M&A is it's multidisciplinary. Okay, it's not something that's, well, here's an M&A book. You often go into areas of product management, for example, or you go into marketing or culture or sales, and so it's understanding all those various disciplines, and that makes you a more well-rounded professional operating in this space.
Brilliant. And in fact, so we're going to, for our viewers and listeners, we're going to include some of the links to these books.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, well, in which case, then I'll give you another book.
Yeah.
This is a good book, Operating Model Canvas.
Yes. The strategy.
Very good book. Another very good book I use quite often. 10 Types of Innovation.
Yeah.
This is a very good book because it really talks about capabilities in a nice, easy to understand way. So if you're looking to improve an organization's value chain or its way it delivers value, then that's a very good book as well. So, I have a few of these. You've got Keyson's book, which is Agile M&A, which I think is good because it actually helps you. The key concept in this one is M&A plays. And plays is a very good concept, which I think he introduced, Keyson. So I think the notion of plays works very well in M&A.
Brilliant. I love this. So any podcasts or any?
No, well, I think M&A is, to be honest, if you've done an MBA, it helps you in this area because really and truly, what you're doing is you're talking the language of finance, or talking the language of marketing, or talking the language of sales, talking the language of HR, and so you, as a professional, need to be fully conversant across all those different disciplines. You're not going to be an expert, but you can converse in all of them well enough so you can have intelligent conversations and help guide those people, because you're there as a kind of like to help sort of like an orchestrator or conductor to guide them through this whole exercise. And they'll be looking to you as a central authority figure to help them in that. And so you need to be able to work with those people, and you've got to talk their language.
Wonderful. And this has been so insightful and also helpful, you sharing your experiences, plus also giving tips. Any other piece of advice or information that you would love to share before we wrap up?
Oh wow! I would say always have a big picture view of what it is you're trying to do. Always think of business outcomes. Don't look at objectives. Look at what's the big picture? What's the purpose of the deal you're working on? What is the strategic purpose? Why did this deal come about? What's the higher goal? Because that's the sort of thing that can easily get lost in those first 30, 60, 90 days of a deal. And if you lose sight of what it is you're doing, you may not be doing the right thing.
That's a wonderful way of wrapping it up, because literally people lose the sight of the forest for the trees, as the English phrase.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, wonderful. And if people want to get in touch with you or have a conversation, especially around the operating model, what's the best way they can get in touch?
Oh, LinkedIn. Just look me up.
LinkedIn?
Yeah, message me, that sort of thing. Yeah, and I respond pretty well.
Brilliant. So this has been such a wonderful discussion, such a wonderful chat here. So Thank you so much, Toby, for joining us
Okay,
as our
thank
guest.
you. Okay, well, thank you very much for having me.
So this was yet another M&A story, and what a story we had today with Toby Tester, right? I absolutely learned quite a few things, and I'm sure you did as well. So if you like the episode, then don't forget to hit the like button. And for those of you who would like to continue hearing and listening to more stories like this, please subscribe to our channel. It's Fifth Chrome Insights, and we are available on 8 podcast channels, including Apple, Spotify, and Google. And of course, we have all our videos with the show notes available on YouTube. Till next time, when we bring you yet another interesting M&A story, I wish you guys all stay healthy, stay safe, and bye-bye.